So now for the first of our panel sessions, I'd like to introduce the facilitator, Angela Ogier. She's the General Manager of Fuel Safety at Genesis Energy, where she's responsible for supply of gas, coal and LPG for generation and retail customers, as well as developing new fuel sources such as biomass, LNG and low-carbon emerging fuels. Angela's 25-year career spans the economic assessment, strategic planning, commercial delivery and negotiation of oil, gas, LNG and pipeline projects in New Zealand, France, Nigeria, the UK and Australia. So I figured she was a good person to get some really provocative discussion going this morning. As a qualified engineer, she has a comprehensive understanding of energy technology, regulation and global energy markets. In particular, she's focused on new technology assessment for unconventional gas, hydrogen, biogas, energy storage and carbon capture and storage. Her commercial strategy and experience has given her hands-on experience in the assessment of project economics and techno-economic assessment in the energy sector. She has a Master's of Engineering from the University of Auckland and an MBA from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Angela.
Tēnā koutou katoa no whangaroa hea hau, no tamaki makaro e tipi aki ana, ko Lane tōku whanau, ko Angela Ogier tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I need a shorter bio, I think, because that was a bit flowery. And I will be pithy and hopefully provocative because that is my job. We're going to have a really interesting session. We're going to have a presentation on the state of the industry and then a bit of a discussion with some key leaders, which I'm hoping will get some good quotes for energy news. So as you've heard, I've had around over 20 years in the oil and gas sector. And in the last 6 months, I've joined the electricity sector. And the overwhelming comment in that has been, you picked a really interesting time to join the electricity sector. And I'd have to agree. In the last 6 months, I've seen a 20% decrease in expected gas production, a dry winter, government failing to secure gas for hospitals and schools until our biggest gas user stepped in, and our biggest gas user shutting in to provide security of supply for the electricity sector. And I know people get scared of labels, but if that's not a crisis, then it's certainly a bit of a dumpster fire. And I think we need to address it. I know, and I don't think this is something it's happened overnight. When I came back to New Zealand 8 years ago, I saw an industry with an alarming level of concentration. At that point, STOS was exiting and the sale of the assets from Shell to OMV was happening. And it was concentrated. And now you roll forward and our only listed gas producers are not viewing their acreage as strategic. The only one that is a minnow on the TSX, NZEC. The other players with access to liquid capital markets are viewing their assets as non-core and going through sale processes. The privately held players are not indicating a willingness to invest or signalling that they will, due to some of the government policy initiatives. And that is really concerning. The government released last week its government policy statement for the electricity sector with a clear focus on energy security, and that's great because that's what we need, and we thank them for that. And there was a really interesting statement which was heartwarming for Genesis as a major provider of energy security, was that electricity system participants need to manage their own portfolio risks. And that sends a clear signal that people need to value the flexibility of gas-fired electricity production and coal in our electricity system, especially as we move to more renewables. But it does beg the question, is that's only security of supply for the electricity sector? So what are we doing for the other 70 to 75% of our energy? What about security of supply for the gas sector? How does that factor in? What about security of supply for LPG? These are really important topics. So in that vein, we've got some really extremely challenging times ahead. We need talent and expertise in our country to make this happen. So to be able to attract people here with a story so we can grow the expertise we need here in Taranaki to develop the fields that we have and develop the LNG facilities if they are to eventuate, and develop the further LPG supply if that's required. And how do we invest in long-lived assets such as LNG import facilities or new gas peakers when usage is uncertain and our electricity sector is only paid when it generates? And in all of that, how do we stay true to a net zero 2050 goal? How do we address climate change in that? We cannot forget that. So this is a super interesting time, and as everyone's been saying to me, super interesting time to join the electricity sector. But as I'm at a gas conference, I have to say it's just a super interesting time to be in the gas sector and LPG sector as well, because this is when it happens. This is when we make the direction for the next 20 years. So to lead us through the dumpster fire and help us navigate that, I'm going to introduce John Kidd, who's going to give an overview of the markets, and then we'll have a bit of a panel session with with some of our leaders from the industry. So John Kidd is Head of Research at Enerlytica, which is an independent energy sector research house and advisor. He leads the New Zealand Energy Intelligence Service. He's known to a lot of us in the sector, and we're grateful that he provides this service. Clients of the service include most New Zealand active energy companies, large energy users, fund managers, professional investors, corporates and governments. John has more than 20 years of analytical consulting and research experience in the energy and resources sector in New Zealand. Before returning to New Zealand, he spent 5 years at Shell's global head office, during which he worked on energy development projects in more than 20 countries across 6 continents. So again, someone who can take us through what's going on. So I'll hand over to you, John.
Good morning, everyone. Dumpster fire. Thank you for that positive and uplifting platform to launch into, Angela. That's very helpful. So what my mandate is just to talk a little bit about the sector, gas and LPG, just for half an hour or so, just to give a walkthrough and what's been going on in the world. As Angela said, it is a fascinating time, and as the Minister very much alluded to, we're coming out of a pretty dark year, but I'm a very firm believer in the whole philosophy of never waste a good crisis. And we've gone through something which has really sparked a whole lot of people into thinking a little more deeply than they probably have been around ways that we could get ourselves through to make sure that what happened last year doesn't happen again. I would say that, one concept that was thrashed around forever for a few years and hasn't really got much oxygen lately is this whole energy trilemma thing. In 2024, I reckon, has been very helpful for just refocusing people towards, the fact that a triangle tends to have 3 edges rather than just one. So we're coming out of a couple of terms of government, frankly, where we've had a very square focus on one of those dimensions, sustainability, and perhaps a little less focus on the likes of affordability and security. And 2024 really has demonstrated that the 3, they operate together. This brings us back, I guess, to gas and LPG. The role that gas and LPG has in supporting security and affordability, while we also strive for sustainability, that can never be lost on anyone. Anyway, I'm going to work through, excuse me, apologies too if I do that every now and then. I'm just coming off the back end of something bad. So it's not because I'm allergic to the audience at all. I'm going to go through a couple of, just talk openly about the sector, what's been going on, and to help you get your head around what's been happening in the last year or so. And, what better way to do that when, I think this is the first time we've come to Taranaki, isn't it, for the forum, or it's the first time that I remember anyway, which is quite ironic because this is where it all happens. This is the beginning and the end of the gas and LPG sector here. You went to Mangahewa, I think, yesterday, some of you. Now, that's a really important piece of the picture here. So this is the energy province, and what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the big 6, which are the big 6 fields which really do provide the backbone of gas supply and LPG supply into the sector here. And, there's a couple of things you can probably take away from this. It's a pretty concentrated sector. We've got a couple of players, and Angela mentioned a couple of very small players that are arguably the most active of them at the moment. It's a very concentrated sector where there is quite a bit of integration across the supply chain as well. So we've literally got probably 3 players of scale, and each of those, they face their own constraints, frankly, in what they're able to do at the moment. And what they're able to do at the moment is always a function of the operating rules that you live under. And for the last 4, 5, 6 years, those operating rules have been fairly deeply unfavourable. So the reinvestment proposition for the small number of players, a number of which have already said that these assets in New Zealand are not core to what they do now, it's tough to be able to bring new production and new spend into the sector. Now that's ironic because we've just gone, and I'll talk this in a minute, we've just come out of a very deep period of reinvestment that has gone in the sector. So in the last 5 years or so, we have seen a couple of $1 billion go into the ground here in Taranaki, and we haven't got out what we had hoped for. That's the bottom line. And we're lurching. 2024 has been a year of lurching from extreme to extreme, and trying to figure out how we get through a change in the world order of fuel. But it's a shallow sector, it's a small sector, there's not a lot going on, and you can see the right-hand side there, not only are the pool of buyers quite small, but they're also quite often related to the upstream players as well. They're quite often related entities. So we live at those big 6 are deeply mature fields. On average, a weighted average, are about 85% deplete. So when you've got, we came off plateau in 2019. When I say plateau, that's when the below ground capacity to deliver began to fall, and we were constrained by, not by plant capacity above ground, but by below ground. So our overall curve began to fall 5 years ago. And across the sector, it's without exception, actually all 6 fields are in varying stages of depletion. So what do you do when you're in charge of those assets like that? You reinvest. It's not about exploration. This is where I think, the best intentions are there from the government overturning things like exploration bans, but it's not going to be exploration that gets us out of this. It's going to be reinvestment in existing assets. Exploration is often a multi-decade proposition, let alone multi-year. Propositions like this are where the capital will likely flow over the next decade or so to essentially extend the dark and extend the overall rectangle for each curve. So to push the overall rectangle out, but the secret sauce is to extend the dark part of that so we get more reserves out of it. So the last couple of years, as you'll be well aware, I put these charts, I think I've been doing this for 10 or 12 years now. I put this chart up every year, and I've always said the same thing. We've got 2 exajoules or 2,000 petajoules of 2P reserves in the tank, and over time we've been roughly stable. It's come and gone, but we've always had about that number. For the last 2 years, we've had very sharp reductions to those numbers. We've had successive downgrades. The downgrade in 2023 was the largest ever, and that was followed in 2024 by the largest ever. So we're now a third lower than what we were 2 years ago. Having said that, I now look less at reserves than we do at deliverability. So reserves are always an academic number. I'm sure I've said this before in this room as well, or different room. There's always an assessment at a point in time of what the economic ability of a field may be under a certain set of conditions. We're now in a gas sector which is constrained by deliverability. How much gas can you get into the system on any given day? Irrespective of reserves, how much can you get out of the ground, given that your above ground capacity is now not the constraint, it's the below ground ability to put into the system. Which is this. This is what deliverability looks like over time. So over those 5 years I mentioned where you've had, we exited plateau in 2019, and that's what it looks like. We've lost 200 terajoules a day of deliverability out of the gas sector. What does that look like in energy terms? There's an array of different measures there on the right-hand side. But the one that's possibly closest to a number of hearts in this room, the bottom one, it's a tenfold number of what retail load is. So it's an enormous amount of energy that has been lost from the system along this chart. It's 2 methanol trains. It's, for Angela's benefit, 110 cargoes or so of coal. That's the equivalent of 200 terajoules a day of gas. It's a huge amount of energy that we're now missing from the system. Now, that's the same chart exploded out over the 5 years. The vertical lines are wells. Now, there's 50 of them. That's a large number of wells, right? That's an extensive reinvestment program. That's about $2 billion that you're seeing on that chart there, just in vertical lines. The point to take away is that the shape of the curve is irrespective of all of that investment that has gone into the ground. The sector has not been sitting back and watching this happen. It has been putting serious money into the ground to try and stabilise this curve, and it just has not happened. And I could probably talk for another hour or two about why exactly that might be, but where we are, that $2 billion is gone, and we're still in a similar situation, or worse actually than what we were at the start of that investment cycle. Now, what happens from here is, I guess, the thing that concerns us the most, because that capital cycle has been mapped for years. We've known that's been coming. It's frankly been mapped since almost before the time that the exploration ban was announced in 2018. It takes that long to get the kit, the manpower, the capital into the country to be able to do this sort of work. That's behind us. So what happens in front of us? And that's where, the concern really does lie from our end as to how this curve goes from here. Because we know that based on the work programs that are in the sector, which we know, frankly, years in advance, these vertical lines aren't coming again with any pace. That's why you're starting to hear people talk about the likes of LNG, which I'll explain a little bit later on as well. But it is a concerning picture, but we've got a little bit of reason for optimism as well, we think. We'll get to that too. That's what the numbers actually look like. So 2 years ago, when the operators reported their numbers into the market, they were required to do that once a year. The aggregate of those numbers built up to 215 petajoules. That's what, in 2024, we as a sector were expecting to see out of the gas sector. And that was on the back of those drilling programs, which were on that last chart. So there was expected to be a return on investment from that money that went in, and we're expected to see a 200 petajoule a year gas market, which we haven't frankly seen before. That's right at the top end of what we have seen in the past. And that's why the likes of Methanex and others have reinvested as they have over the last couple of years. Excuse me. That's not the case anymore. The case is the situation on the right. We're looking at more towards 120 petajoules of gas this year. We're well through the year, of course, so we're pretty confident in that number. And you can see the red there is a downgrade to every field compared to what was reported by the operators 2 years ago. So that return on investment for those wells that have been drilled has not come. And we're in a very different gas situation to what we were expecting to be even just 2 years ago. So, do not adjust your sets. We are currently in a gas surplus. How on earth can that be, do you ask? And that's a very good question that Angela's going to answer. What's happened, and she already did essentially answer it. We saw a deal under some stress, not duress, but some stress, on the 13th of August that saw the ultimate demand-side response occur in the market, which is where the generators, Contact and Genesis, essentially bought out Methanex, and Methanex shut down its remaining plant in Motunui, which you may have seen for those who went out to Mangahewa yesterday. It's one of the original gas-to-gasoline plants. Fascinating. Let's go and read the history of that. It's well worth taking in on its own right. Anyway, that plant is now dormant, idle. I gave a talk the other day, which was talking about the foregone economics that NZ Inc. has worn on the back of that this year. Between TY and Methanex, we're looking at about $300 million of lost export revenue this year, just by not doing what they're doing. So, always try and express caution when you hear the words demand response, because it's never costless. It's never zero sum. There is always somewhere a cost to be made, and that's where it currently is at the moment with Methanex. Anyway, that deal saw Methanex turn off, and 80 to 85 terajoules a day of gas came into the system almost instantaneously. And at that point in time, it also rained. And we have now got in a situation where we do not have the ability to place that gas in its entirety into the market. It's too big. So we don't have the ability to do anything else with it other than to resort to big borrowing, stealing tactics to deal with it along the way. So that every possible tactic, I think, has been taken up upstream, trying to get the producers to dial back on their production. Downstream, putting gas into places that probably shouldn't go, frankly. And we're all just sort of waiting until the end of October to see this thing behind us so that we can get back to the crisis that we were originally in. Sure. Okay, that's cool, sorry. So we are in a gas surplus right at the moment, which is quite ridiculous to say, but I'll say it with some confidence in, we'll get through this because contractually it will end at the end of the month, but we'll move into another chapter. Now, that's all quite dark, but what we want to try and impress on all this is that, we're in a space now where never waste a good crisis. We've just gone through what we've gone through. We understand where we have gone wrong in large part in 2024. Looking forward, we've got a number of shock absorbers which are in the system that we didn't previously have. And there's a bunch of them there listed. Bear in mind that when you talk to the system operator, Transpower, they will exercise a lot of caution towards 2025. They're very worried about 2025, the winter for 2025, and it's a capacity problem next year. This year it's been largely a fuel problem. We haven't had the juice to be able to put through the capacity that we have, whether it's water, whether it's gas. We just haven't had it. Next year, the challenge becomes one more of capacity. We're seeing some thermal decommissionings next year, one big one in particular at Taranaki at Stratford. One of the only 2 combined cycles that we have is scheduled to be decommissioned at the end of this year. That's a problem, but it's a problem that has a solution as well. But the point is, if you work through what options we do have now, we're actually somewhat optimistic towards the ability for the sector to do far better than what they have this year to be able to cobble their way through this. I won't go through each one in detail, but the point of the chart on the left is to say, look, even if you just look at Methanex, what Methanex has just done is been, frankly, pushing the nuclear button on what just happened. Turn it off and just get all the gas that's available in the system. We've figured out that that's too much gas for the system to be able to absorb. But there is a sweet spot, a zone in there where Methanex, because of their operating range that they now do run to, and I won't bore you with the detail of that other than to say there is a sweet spot within that one plant that they do have that allows them to be able to concertina somewhat. And I'm just talking in theory here. It hasn't happened yet, but it seems like a good idea, so why not put it out there? Methanex being able to come and go in and out of the market as the market needs it, rather than just to say, hey, we're off, over to you. That's and the extent of that capacity that Methanex have is actually greater, which is the intention of the polygons there, greater than what NZA is, which is TY point. This is what TY's just done this year on a gigawatt hours basis. The overall wedge that Methanex is able to offer into the sector, that 50 terajoules a day, is greater. And the shape of that rectangle doesn't do justice to it, because inside that rectangle, we would argue there's a hell of a lot more flex available than what there is out of the TY wedge. The TY wedge it is non-negotiable. It is a seasonal wedge of energy. You don't get it's not flex, it's just a wedge of energy, not dissimilar to what Methanex has done this year with putting all of their gas into the market, take it or leave it. So we think there's a reason for optimism next year that with all of these things that are now on the sort of smorgasbord, that there's a way we could cobble our way through this better than what we have in the past year. Now, LNG, this is just a one-slider to it. I realise there'll be probably a number of people in the room who don't fully understand what LNG is. So it's just a real simple explanation as to what it is, because we hear a lot of talk around what it actually isn't. It is an option. LNG is an option. It is not necessarily a fuel. It is a fuel if you want it to be, but the whole point of the exercise is that it establishes a hot point to enable you to bring fuel into the system if you choose to do so. Now, the establishment of that hot point is the interesting part of the whole thing. So what's the capex that you need to put into the ground to be able to establish it? And this is not obviously a project in New Zealand, but this is how it could look if it was to be installed here. The ship on the left is one that is on station across season, whether it be across the year or across the winter, however long it's going to be. And the one on the right is the vessel that offloads into that ship on the left. The ship on the left you can think of that as being 4 petajoules of storage in one hit. It's frozen gas, right? That's all it is. It's just frozen gas, and you rewarm it back up and you put it into the system. You can see the pipeline there across the water. That feeds directly into the existing pipeline network. That's exactly what would happen here. Quite possibly this could be something that you could see at Port Taranaki. The Maui pipeline runs right beside Port Taranaki. You can have something like this that plugs directly in. But the whole point of the infrastructure we're talking about is that it is an option, not an obligation to do anything. So it's an infrastructure play. It is about spending the money to enable this type of infrastructure to be available into the country if the country needs it. Think about the last 4 years, right? We've had 4 extreme winters in the last 4 years. 2021, 2024, extremely dry. 2022, 2023, extremely wet. 22 and 23, it is entirely feasible that this vessel may not even be required. LNG would not be needed, but the option is there to have it. In 2021, 24, very likely it would have been called on. We don't have that option at the moment. That's the space that's trying to be filled when people are talking about progressing the LNG option. So it's floating, it's modular, it comes and goes. You could quite feasibly share the vessel that's here on station with the Northern Hemisphere in its winter. There's nothing stopping you doing that. So the costs become quite, compared to what, 15 years ago when we were looking at an LNG terminal in Taranaki, it was permanent, onshore, best part of $1 billion, and that's entirely the opposite of what we'd be looking at here. How would it fit into the system? There's a very sweet spot with power gen, is the bottom line. This is a matrix which we've put together just based on the dimensions that gas supply and demand sort of work to. And there's, frankly, the ability to pay that power gen has is higher than what a lot of industry has. And on the 4 dimensions that we put there, volume, flex, term, and low price is a very comfortable fit with power gen, which is really the space that it presents the greatest opportunity. Now, LPG, really interesting sector, the forgotten fuel. People, do tend to look past it in Wellington. It's just, that's a crime in itself because it is the fuel that just keeps on proving itself again and again, year in, year out, whether you're talking about natural disasters or whether you're talking about just the ability to keeps customers whole. In some ways, I just talked about, where was I? Pushing the wrong button. Excuse me. If you think about LNG, it's kind of like LPG, right? You have indigenous supply, but you have the ability to be able to tap into non-indigenous supply as well to be able to meet market demand. It's actually quite similar. And therefore, you're able to ensure that supply is never interrupted because you have multiple channels to be able to call on. Now, back to that original plot, we've actually got 5 of the 6 fields which are LPG capable. They are able to produce LPG. They don't all produce LPG at any one point in time. Frankly, it's been more lucrative to produce gas in the last year. So those that have the option of producing LPG have tended not to. And, it's more lucrative just to put the propane and butane into the gas stream and bank the gas price. But we do have a fairly extensive 5 of those 6 big fields, the big 6, are able to produce LPG. Now, we've seen a sharp reduction in LPG supply over pretty much since Kupe started coming itself off plateau. Kupe is a big deal in the domestic LPG sector. You can see there it's about 66,000 tonne, I think, was produced last year of 129, so more than half. And that number, that 66,000, is well down on what it was at its peak, which was north of 100,000 tonne. So we've got a 200,000 tonne a year market domestically, demand. 100,000 tonne a year used to come from Kupe as supply, so it's a very big deal. We are a net import market here for LPG, so the total supply out of LPG is nowhere near sufficient to be able to meet total demand in the country, so we are a net import market. But yeah, Kupe domestic yields on LPG are going to continue to decline. You've probably seen some press earlier in the year about a well that was unsuccessful at Kupe. That was an important well, not just for gas, which is part of the malaise that we've had in 2024. Genesis didn't have 30 terajoules a day of gas out of that well that they thought they were going to have before winter. Therefore, you've got to fall back onto other options, including coal. Well, it's also an important well, or it was an important well for LPG, and that didn't deliver. So we're going to see a continuation of the decline that we've seen over the last decade or so. On a demand basis, LPG has been going really, really well. And that hasn't really changed at all in the last few years. We quite often put out stuff on this because it fascinates us, frankly, just how strongly LPG continues to perform on a demand basis compared to other fuels. In fact, I'll skip forward one just to show you on relative terms. The chart on the left here, this is LPG, gas and electricity connections indexed back to a decade or so ago. And you can see there's bugger all growth when it comes to electricity and gas, but LPG connections continue to grow really, really strongly. Are we through 300,000? Not quite. Very, very close.
300 odd.
300 odd. Yeah, we're rounding error type stuff. But the point is that, the fuel is an extremely popular one, not just on a gross basis, so on a connections basis, there it is, but on a relative basis on the right-hand side there, it looks dead flat, and it is pretty much dead flat, but there's a slight increase in that linear line there, which is it dates back only to when data is available, but there is still a very slight increase in per ICP usage. So on gross terms, on absolute terms, on number of ICPs, and in relative terms, there is growth across both. Now that's quite different to the rest of the energy sector. We're just now starting to see growth out of electricity. And I almost can't believe I said that, because the electricity sector this year is going to be quite a bit lower than what it was last year, because you look at the likes of TY and other losses from the sector, we're going to be going probably backwards compared to where we were last year. But at the beginning of the year, we were seeing organic growth finally starting to come through into electricity demand. So the electrification programs that some have been going through, that it is now starting to show through in statistics. We hadn't seen any demand growth in electricity since the GFC. We saw a decade of uninterrupted economic growth through the 2010s, but zero demand growth in electricity. That's entirely different to the situation with LPG. So unpicking that slightly, there's a lot of numbers on here, and I'll just talk you through a couple of very headline ones. There used to be a dead even split between the North and the South Island. Almost to the decimal point, used to be 50-50. That's now separated, and we've now got stronger growth or stronger demand in the North Island. We seem to have lost a large industrial somewhere along the way in the South Island. That's what happens. But in the North Island, that growth is still there. You can see it's based on these stats, which I think are to August, so they're pretty current, up 5% on total across the year. So bulk is up strongly. 45s are up strongly. Forklifts will continue to erode, I expect, generally due to electrification. Automotive is in terminal decline. It is what it is. But when the backbone of demand is still growing at a good clip of knots, and as I say, well in excess of what electricity and gas is. Cylinder sales, you can see the trend there, uninterrupted, still going very nicely. 9 kg swaps out of on-gas, they are in decline, but they seem to have evened out a bit as well in the last couple of years. I expect that's probably something to do with space heating, and people still need to do their barbecues, but space heat is less so. So we're still in the import market. That's the reality. So we do have a plenty of infrastructure in place to be able to support that. And, I think it's a fairly strong aim to say that most of that infrastructure, or at least some of it, is heavily underutilised. You could do a hell of a lot more than what we do currently with what we have. I still can't get my head around, and maybe, Al, you can help me here, that apparently we're exporting large volumes of LPG. These are official MB numbers, exporting large volumes of LPG over winter this year. No, I wouldn't have thought so either. But we are an import market, full stop. So we take product in from generally, from anywhere really. We're ambivalent, we're fuel agnostic, as the government would now say, or destination or origin agnostic. It comes in, it services South Island. South Island is clearly an import market. Again, agnostic as to where that product comes from the North Island, from Australia, wherever. It's pretty likely over the next 2 years we're going to see the North Island also flip to net import because of the decline in coupe. That's going to get us to a point where it's not able to support the demand growth or the demand in the North Island. So the North Island's going to flip as well onto net import. The point is that's not a problem. We've got plenty of supply infrastructure in place to be able to support that. And to pricing, no surprises here. Regional pricing is very much based on Saudi CP, which itself has a long-term correlation to Brent oil. There is, your view on Brent oil is essentially what your view will be on import pricing for LPG that comes into the country. You can take your own view on that as to what's going to happen in Iran. I personally don't have any personal insight or intelligence to offer into that space. But other than to say that Iran is a very big producer of all things petroleum, including LPG, and the world's obviously watching pretty hard. But even this morning there was something on the wire from the IEA. Chinese demand is quite concerning, and the industrial demand out of China, and there are progressive downgrades in oil demand and therefore supply that are being put through the market at the moment. So there seems to be, there's obviously concern about the Middle East, but there is also deep concern around what's going on in China, and there seems to be a somewhat of a comfortable space there at the moment with where oil prices are at. Last slide. So we're quite interested actually increasingly in what LPG could do beyond what it currently does. We've done quite a bit of work in the LNG space, and go and have a Google if you want to get the full detail of that. But in that same space, we're looking at alternative fuels, and LPG becomes quite interesting there. Whether you're talking about power gen, whether you're talking about blending into the local system, like I say, we've got unconstrained ability to bring fuel into the system from wherever we like. It's an expensive option, but all options are currently expensive. What we do have is infrastructure in place to be able to support that. Whether it's at Wiri, whether it's at Port Taranaki or in the South Island, the infrastructure that is available there, we should be taking advantage of it. And we're personally very, we follow this quite closely, just the ability for LPG to contribute more into the system than what it currently does, using the infrastructure that we already have in place. I'm going to cut it there, Angela, and we'll see where we go.